And we're back talking about how natural resource development opportunities in Canada affects First Nations communities. Uh, John, before the break, mentioned I want to ask you about tax revenues. When a band has their land and it's being developed, and maybe in partnership with a private company for an oil and gas project or mining or forestry or whatever, there's often tax revenues and royalties in that get shared. Is that common, and how any numbers on how big that is for the country in terms of money that starts to flow into Aboriginal communities?
Yeah, and so I guess it's not particularly common because there's a reservation, there's the land that different bands are on, and there's the projects, there's the amount of land that that is afforded to them, and the potential development projects on that land. I think more the and then of course, absolutely, there's the royalties that are generated. There's profoundly important because they afford the community to self-determine how they want to reinvest that, not just economic development, but also socioeconomically in terms of infrastructure, programming, language, education, health. So that's important. But that speaks to kind of the greater opportunity. It's more the traditional territory, less the actual land base, reserve land base territory where rights and impact really lie, and where the relationship with resource development and Indigenous people really, I think, it's more substantive in Canada, and I think that's where the bigger conversation is, and really lends itself to the business case of including communities. As partners and figuring this out as opposed to a part of the process. Indigenous communities, and we're seeing that in terms of bringing Indigenous communities in for ownership opportunities, less, revenue sharing, less tax, or less royalties off of profits, but more, what's the opportunity for communities to invest in the actual ownership of the infrastructure, the assets, the cash flow generating assets. That's the conversation that's also happening now. In addition to the funds, that's affording communities an ability to participate and grow capacity in the areas that I think that define business success, right? So getting to learn governance and authority, decision making, risk, project design, and so participating in an ownership gives a seat at those table to be able to inform those development decisions, but also to provide the value of being an Indigenous participant and a proponent of ensuring projects go through. So yeah, incredibly and profoundly important.
So I want to shift gears a bit, talk about those discussions that happen before these projects go ahead, and even as once they start moving forward. To begin, I talked about the Coastal GasLink project, the pipeline that's going through in British Columbia, and before COVID, we heard about the people, different groups protesting in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people, and we were given this impression through the media that the Wet'suwet'en people in BC just didn't want this. You got this impression that here's this pipeline coming in into their land and the people don't want it, whatever. And we often hear that type of message, but are you aware of any maybe public opinion research or research that's
Mhm.
been done sort of more broadly in Canada
Yeah,
that looks at how people in First Nations actually feel about natural resource projects moving forward versus maybe what we're hearing in the media? Is there a gap there?
there absolutely is. So the Indigenous Resource Network built itself off a poll to be able to substantiate what we felt anecdotally, which was Indigenous people support resource development, which is what our poll found. We polled across Canada and found that 65% of Indigenous people support development. But there's caveats in the understanding. So, first of all, we stood it up because we wanted to challenge, I think, the sensationalization of Indigenous sentiment around resource development. And the poll did that, but we wanted to dive in a little deeper. And so, in my experience and the experience of my peers and amongst our network, is that Indigenous people aren't opposed to development. Indigenous people are just opposed to not being part of that process in terms of determining feasibility, determining project design outcomes. Just where everything is decided. It's the paternalism, where Indigenous people were treated as a stakeholder, as part of the risk. I think that's where Indigenous people, have been sitting and not necessarily frustrated, wanting to work through that. It's just a post and not being part of that process. Where you do see Indigenous communities involved in that process, great success in terms of championing and advocating for the development project, in terms of ownership, in terms of participation, supporting development, things like that. And so that's what we found. The general sentiment was we are in favor, just we want to be partners and we want to be part of that process.
Okay, and when we come back, we'll talk more about this important topic.